The fluorescent lights of Gate 47 hummed overhead as Corporal Renata Voss sat with her back against the concrete pillar, her faded olive duffel bag tucked between her boots. The airport terminal buzzed with the chaos of delayed flights and frustrated travelers, their voices blending into a dull roar that reminded her of distant artillery fire. She closed her eyes for just a moment, willing the comparison away, focusing instead on the smell of overpriced coffee and the rhythmic squeak of luggage wheels against polished floors. She had been sitting there for 3 hours now, waiting for her connecting flight to Denver. The hoodie she wore was 2 sizes too large, gray and worn at the cuffs, and her jeans were the kind you bought at discount stores without trying them on first. Nothing about her suggested anything remarkable. Nothing about her invited a second glance. That was exactly how she preferred it. Renata watched the crowd with the kind of awareness that never quite shut off, even 2 years after her discharge. Her eyes tracked movement patterns, identified exits, noted the family arguing near the departures board, and the businessman who kept checking his watch every 45 seconds. Old habits, useful habits, habits that had kept her alive when it mattered most. The woman appeared first, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a blade. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, wearing a crisp business suit that probably cost more than Renata had spent on clothes in the past 5 years. Her heels clicked with authority against the floor. "Ma'am, I need you to move," the woman said, standing over Renata with her arms crossed. "This area is for premium passengers only." Renata looked up slowly, taking in the woman's expression of practiced disdain. She glanced around at the empty seats surrounding them, at least 24 chairs that no one was using. "I'm not in anyone's way," Renata said quietly, her voice steady but soft. "I'm just waiting for my flight like everyone else." The woman's eyes narrowed as they swept over Renata's appearance, lingering on the worn hoodie and the scuffed duffel bag. Her lip curled slightly. "I'm sure you are, but this is a priority seating area. You'll need to move to general boarding. Before we continue with what happened next, drop a comment and let us know what state you're watching from. Maybe you've seen moments like this in your own community, where someone's appearance told a story that wasn't quite true." Renata felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same sensation she got when someone cut her off in traffic or when a door slammed too loudly in a grocery store. She breathed through it, counted to 5, let it pass. Getting upset never helped. Confrontation never solved anything that mattered. "There's no sign," Renata said, keeping her voice even. "I checked when I sat down." A man joined them now, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a polo shirt with a corporate logo she didn't recognize. He looked at Renata the way people look at things they consider beneath their notice. "Is there a problem here?" he asked the woman, though his eyes never left Renata. "This person is refusing to move from the premium seating area," the woman said, as if Renata weren't sitting right there in front of them. The man sighed heavily, the kind of sigh that said his patience was already exhausted before this conversation even began. "Look, miss, we don't want to make a scene here. Just gather your things and move along. There are plenty of other seats." Renata's jaw tightened. She could feel eyes turning toward them now, other passengers noticing the confrontation, some with curiosity, others with the blank stare of people who had decided this wasn't their problem. A teenage boy had his phone out, angled toward them. Recording, or just scrolling, she couldn't tell. Her duffel bag sat between her feet, its canvas fabric faded from sun and dust. The zipper pull wrapped with paracord she had braided herself during the long nights at Forward Operating Base Cushman. Inside were her few possessions, everything she owned that mattered, packed with the efficiency that came from years of living out a rucksack. "I have as much right to sit here as anyone else," Renata said, and for the first time, something harder crept in her voice. A firmness that came from deep in her chest, from the part of her that had given orders under mortar fire and made decisions that meant life or death. The woman's face flushed red. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising. "Do you know who I am? I am a gold-level frequent flyer with this airline. I have been flying with them for 15 years. Renata said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. The man stepped closer, his presence meant to intimidate, to force her into compliance through proximity alone. His cologne was thick, cloying, and it mixed badly with the airport smell of recycled air and fast food. "You're creating a disturbance," he said. "If you don't move right now, I'm going to call security and have you removed from the terminal entirely. Is that what you want?" Renata felt the weight of their stares pressing down on her shoulders like sandbags stacked against a bunker wall. She kept her breathing steady, controlled, the way she had learned during those first weeks of basic training when the drill sergeants got in your face and tested whether you would break or bend. She had learned to bend just enough to survive without breaking who she was at her core. The woman pulled out her phone with theatrical precision, her manicured nails clicking against the screen. "I'm calling security right now," she announced loudly, making sure everyone within earshot understood the gravity of the situation. This is absolutely unacceptable behavior. Around them, the crowd had shifted. Some passengers had moved closer, drawn by the spectacle the way people always were when conflict erupted in public spaces. Others had deliberately turned away, burying themselves in their phones, or suddenly finding their boarding passes fascinating. A young mother with 2 small children hurried past, pulling her kids closer as if poverty or defiance might be contagious. The man crossed his arms over his chest, settling into a wide stance that said he wasn't going anywhere until this situation resolved in his favor. "You know, people like you are exactly what's wrong with air travel these days," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "No respect for rules, no consideration for others who actually pay for premium services." Renata's hands rested on her knees, relaxed but ready. Muscle memory was a strange thing. Years after leaving the service, her body still knew how to shift from stillness to action in a fraction of a second. Her fingers remembered the weight of a rifle, the proper grip, the smooth motion of bringing it to bear. But those days were behind her now, packed away like everything else she tried not to think about. "I'm not in a premium seat," Renata said quietly. "I'm sitting on the floor against a pillar. I'm not using any airline resources." The woman's eyes flashed with something beyond annoyance now, something closer to genuine anger. She wasn't used to being contradicted. That much was obvious. Her whole posture radiated entitlement, the kind that came from a lifetime of getting exactly what she wanted whenever she wanted it. "That's not the point," the woman snapped. "The point is that you clearly don't belong here. This terminal has standards." A security guard appeared at the edge of the growing circle of onlookers, a younger man with a fresh face and a uniform that still had crisp creases. He looked uncertain, his eyes moving between Renata and the 2 people standing over her. "What seems to be the problem here?" the guard asked, his hand resting on his radio. The woman turned to him immediately, relief flooding her features. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This person has been loitering in the premium seating area despite multiple requests to move. She's being aggressive and refusing to comply with airline policy." Renata almost laughed at the description. Aggressive. She had been sitting quietly with her back against a pillar, bothering no one, until these 2 had decided her presence offended them. But she held her tongue, knowing that anything she said now would be twisted into evidence of the aggression they claimed she possessed. The guard approached Renata, and she could see him taking in her appearance, making the same calculations everyone else had made. Worn clothes, old bag, no visible signs of the kind of wealth that typically populated airport terminals. His expression shifted subtly, and she recognized the look. He had already decided which side of this conflict deserved his support. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me," the guard said, his voice trying for authoritative but landing somewhere closer to apologetic. Renata's jaw clenched. She had been through interrogations by enemy combatants who spoke through interpreters and threats. She had sat across from men who would have killed her without hesitation if the circumstances had been different. This should have felt insignificant in comparison, but somehow it cut deeper. Those enemies had been honest about their hatred. These people hid theirs behind words like policy and standards and appropriate behavior. "I haven't broken any laws," Renata said, looking directly at the guard. "I haven't violated any airline policies. I'm a ticketed passenger waiting for my flight. The businessman stepped forward, inserting himself between Renata and the guard. Look, this is getting ridiculous, he said. She's clearly homeless or transient or something. She probably doesn't even have a valid ticket. Just remove her so the rest of us can go about our business in peace. Something cold settled in Renata's chest at those words. Homeless. Transient. Something. As if she were less than human. A problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. She had heard variations of these assumptions before, in the 2 years since she had taken off the uniform for the last time. People saw the worn clothes and the quiet demeanor and the avoidance of eye contact, and they created stories about who she must be. They never imagined that she might be someone who had bled for them, someone who had carried their flag into places where death waited around every corner, someone who had made choices they would never have to make, borne burdens they would never have to carry. The guard shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable, but also clearly ready to take the path of least resistance. Ma'am, if you could just show me your boarding pass and ID, we can clear this up quickly. Renata reached slowly for her duffel bag, moving with deliberate care because sudden movements around security personnel never ended well. Her fingers found the outer pocket where she kept her documents, and she pulled out her boarding pass and her driver's license. Both were valid. Both were legitimate. Both proved exactly what she had been saying all along. She handed them to the guard without a word. He examined them, his brow furrowing slightly, and then he looked back at Renata with something that might have been the beginning of doubt. The guard studied the documents for a long moment, his eyes moving between the photo on the license and Renata's face. Everything checks out, he said finally, though his tone suggested he wished it didn't. You're cleared to be in the terminal, ma'am. The businessman's face reddened, his neck bulging slightly over his collar. That's ridiculous, he said. Just because she managed to buy a ticket doesn't mean she should be camped out in premium areas. Look at her. She's practically sleeping on the floor like some kind of vagrant. Renata stood slowly, her movements fluid despite the stiffness from sitting for 3 hours. She was average height, maybe 5'7", but something in the way she carried herself made her seem taller. Her spine was straight, her shoulders square, and when she made eye contact with the businessman, he actually took a half step backward before catching himself. I'm waiting for my flight, Renata said, her voice quiet but carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. Just like you. Just like everyone else here. The woman wasn't ready to concede defeat. She turned to the guard with an expression of disbelief. So you're just going to let her stay here? In this condition? She's making other passengers uncomfortable. That has to violate some kind of code of conduct. The guard looked uncomfortable, caught between policy and the expectations of passengers who clearly considered themselves important. I can ask her to move to a different location if other passengers have concerns, he offered weakly. A voice cut through the tension from somewhere behind them. She's not bothering anyone. An older man had spoken, probably in his 60s, with steel gray hair and weathered hands. He was sitting 3 rows back, and his tone carried the kind of authority that came from a lifetime of being listened to. Let her be. The businessman whirled on him. Excuse me? This is none of your concern. The older man stood, moving with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints didn't cooperate the way they once had. I'm making it my concern, he said. She's got a ticket. She's not causing trouble. The only people making a scene here are you two. The woman's mouth opened and closed, searching for a response. The crowd around them had grown larger now, phones definitely out and recording. The teenage boy from earlier had moved closer, his camera trained on the confrontation. Whatever happened next would be documented, shared, dissected by strangers on the internet who loved nothing more than watching people destroy themselves in public. This is about standards, the woman said, but her voice had lost some of its conviction. About maintaining a certain level of decorum in public spaces. Renata felt a familiar tightness spreading across her chest, the precursor to the panic that sometimes crept up on her without warning. Too many people. Too much attention. Too many eyes watching, judging, waiting for her to react. She focused on her breathing, counting the inhales, matching them with exhales. 4 counts in, hold for 4, 4 counts out. The rhythm of staying centered when the world tried to pull you apart. The businessman wasn't finished. He pointed at Renata's duffel bag with barely concealed disgust. That thing probably hasn't been cleaned in years. Who knows what she's carrying in there? For all we know, it could be dangerous. The guard's hand moved unconsciously toward his radio at the word dangerous, his training kicking in despite the absurdity of the suggestion. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to open your bag for inspection. Renata's hands tightened into fists at her sides, then consciously relaxed. She had nothing to hide, nothing illegal, nothing dangerous in the ways they imagined. But the bag was hers, her private space, the small container that held everything she had chosen to keep from a life that felt increasingly distant. You don't have probable cause, Renata said quietly. You can't search my bag without reason. The businessman laughed, a harsh sound that held no humor. Probable cause? Listen to her, acting like she knows the law. You give these people an inch, and they take a mile. These people. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implication. Renata had heard variations of that phrase before, in 100 different contexts, and it never meant anything good. It was the language of division, of othering, of deciding that some humans deserved less dignity than others. A woman in a flight attendant uniform had stopped nearby, drawn by the commotion. Her name tag read Diane, and she looked at the scene with the weariness of someone who had witnessed too many passenger disputes. Is everything all right here? No, the businessman said immediately. This woman is loitering in the terminal and refusing to move when asked. She's making everyone uncomfortable. Diane looked at Renata, then at the boarding pass still in her hand, then back at the businessman. She has a valid ticket. She's allowed to wait for her flight wherever she chooses within the public areas of the terminal. The businessman's face was now a deep shade of red that suggested his blood pressure had reached dangerous levels. This is unbelievable, he said. Absolutely unbelievable. I spend thousands of dollars a year with this airline. And this is how you treat your loyal customers? By siding with freeloaders? Renata closed her eyes for just a moment. She was back in the desert, the sun beating down like a physical weight, the taste of dust in her mouth. The sound of the market square, vendors calling out their wares, children laughing, and then the sudden shift in the air that meant danger. Her team leader's voice in her ear, steady and calm. Contact left. She could feel the rifle in her hands, the weight of the plates in her vest, the way her heart rate slowed instead of spiked, because that was what training did, what experience taught you. When she opened her eyes, she was back in the terminal, surrounded by people who saw her as a problem to be solved rather than a person to be respected. The businessman was still talking, his voice rising, and the woman was nodding along with everything he said. The security guard looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The small crowd of onlookers had their phones out, recording everything, and Renata wondered what story they would tell when they posted the videos online. Fine, the businessman said suddenly, his voice sharp with decision. If security won't do their job, I'll handle this myself. The businessman reached down toward Renata's duffel bag, his fingers stretching for the worn canvas handles. His intention was clear in the set of his jaw, in the way his shoulders hunched forward with aggressive purpose. He was going to move her belongings himself, force the situation to resolve the way he wanted it to, consequences be damned. Renata's hand shot out, not striking, but intercepting, her fingers wrapping around his wrist with precise pressure. The movement was instinctive, trained, the kind of reaction that came from muscle memory built over years of close-quarters combat drills. She didn't squeeze hard, didn't apply the kind of force that would cause pain, but her grip was absolutely firm. "Don't touch my property," she said, her voice level and cold. The businessman's eyes went wide, shock and anger warring for dominance on his face. He tried to pull his wrist free and found he couldn't, not without escalating to a physical struggle that even he seemed to recognize would make him look bad in front of all the recording phones. "Get your hands off me," he hissed. "That's assault. Everyone here is a witness." "You reached for my belongings without permission," Renata said. "I'm protecting my property. That's not assault. That's defense." The security guard finally found his voice, stepping forward with his hands raised. "Okay, everyone just calm down. Let's not let this get out of hand. Ma'am, please release him. Renata let go immediately, her hand dropping back to her side. The businessman stumbled backward, rubbing his wrist dramatically as if she had actually hurt him. She assaulted me, he said loudly, looking around at the crowd. You all saw it. She grabbed me. You tried to take her bag, the older man said from his seat, his voice carrying clearly. We all saw that too. The woman in the business suit had her phone out now, filming everything. This is going straight to corporate, she said. This kind of violent behavior cannot be tolerated. I'm documenting everything. Diane, the flight attendant, looked like she wanted to disappear into the polished floor. Sir, I really think it would be best if you just stepped away and let this situation de-escalate, she said to the businessman. He ignored her completely, his attention laser-focused on Renata. You want to play tough? He said, his voice dropping to something that tried to sound threatening. You think you're some kind of badass because you can grab someone's wrist? I could have you arrested. I could have you banned from every airport in this country. Renata said nothing. She had learned long ago that silence was often the most powerful response, that letting angry people fill the quiet with their own words usually revealed more about them than anything she could say. Her hands hung loose at her sides, relaxed but ready. She could feel her heartbeat, steady and calm, the way it always became when situations turned physical. It was strange how the body remembered, how it prepared even when the mind wanted peace. The businessman took a step closer, invading her personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. The guard should have intervened, but seemed frozen, uncertain how to handle a situation that had escalated beyond his training or experience. Other passengers were backing away now, creating a wider circle, the universal human response to impending violence. You don't belong here, the businessman said, his voice low and venomous. People like you, with your ragged clothes and your attitude, you drag down society. You're probably on welfare, probably gaming the system, and now you're taking up space that real taxpayers deserve. The words washed over Renata like water. She had heard worse, had been called worse by people who actually had the power and weapons to back up their threats. This man was nothing, just another civilian who had never been tested, never been pushed to the absolute limit of what a human being could endure. He was a child throwing a tantrum because the world hadn't arranged itself to his liking. I paid for my ticket, Renata said quietly. Same as you. With what? The woman interjected, stepping up beside the businessman. Food stamps? We all know your type. Probably military surplus trash who couldn't hack it in the real world. Probably got kicked out for failing a drug test. Something flickered in Renata's eyes at those words, something cold and hard that made the woman falter mid-sentence. Military surplus trash. The phrase hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled, everyone waiting to see what would happen next. The older man stood up fully now, his face set in lines of deep disapproval. You need to watch your mouth, he said to the woman. You don't know what you're talking about. Oh, please, the woman said, waving him off. Look at her. It's obvious. Probably served a couple years and got kicked out, and now she thinks the world owes her something. That's how they all are. The businessman reached for the duffel bag again, more aggressively this time, and Renata moved to block him. The movement was smooth, economical, her body shifting to put herself between him and her belongings. He pushed at her shoulder, not hard enough to knock her down, but enough to make his intention clear. He was willing to get physical if that's what it took. Move, he snarled. No, Renata said. The guard finally seemed to wake up, stepping forward with his hand on his radio. Sir, I need you to step back right now. This is your final warning. The businessman ignored him, reaching around Renata for the bag. She shifted again, and he grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in with enough force to leave marks. The crowd gasped, phones held higher, everyone recording the moment when this confrontation crossed from verbal to physical. Renata could have broken his grip easily, could have put him on the ground in 3 different ways, each one fast and efficient and completely legal under the circumstances. But she didn't. She stood there and let him hold her arm, let him prove to everyone watching exactly who he was, what he was willing to do to someone he considered beneath him. Let go of me, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the terminal. "Make me," he said, and then he grabbed the duffel bag with his other hand and yanked hard. The worn canvas, weakened by years of use and exposure to desert sand and mountain cold, and everything in between, finally gave way. The zipper, already strained, split open with a sharp tearing sound. The bag tumbled from between Renata's boots, and its contents spilled across the polished airport floor in front of everyone. Time seemed to slow as Renata's belongings scattered across the polished terminal floor. A worn gray t-shirt unfurled like a flag. A travel-sized toothbrush skittered toward someone's luggage. A paperback book with a cracked spine landed face down, its pages splayed. Socks rolled in tight bundles, the way soldiers learned to pack them to save space. A small zippered pouch containing toiletries. Everything she owned that mattered, exposed for strangers to judge. The businessman stood there breathing hard, still gripping the torn canvas of the bag, his face flushed with triumph and residual anger. The woman beside him had her phone raised high, capturing everything, probably already composing the social media post in her head about the disruptive passenger who had finally been put in her place. Renata dropped to her knees, reaching for her scattered possessions with hands that trembled slightly. Not from fear or anger, but from something deeper, something closer to shame. These were her private things, her small dignities, now spread across public space for everyone to see and assess and find wanting. She reached for the t-shirt first, folding it quickly with practiced efficiency. Then the socks. Then the book, its cover worn smooth from being read dozens of times during long nights when sleep wouldn't come. Her fingers moved automatically, gathering and organizing, trying to restore order to chaos the way she had learned to do in situations far more dire than this. The small wooden case rolled past her reaching hand, tumbling across the smooth floor with a hollow sound that seemed louder than it should have been. It was rectangular, about the size of a large smartphone, made of dark walnut wood polished to a deep shine. The case came to rest against the wheel of someone's carry-on luggage, and for a moment, nobody seemed to notice it. Renata's breath caught in her throat. She lunged for the case, but the businessman saw her sudden movement and kicked it away, sending it spinning further across the floor. His face held a cruel smile, the expression of someone who had found a new way to inflict humiliation. "What's in the fancy box?" he taunted. "Stolen jewelry? Drugs?" The case skidded across the terminal floor, and this time when it hit the edge of a bench leg, the small brass latch popped open. The lid swung wide, and something fell out, catching the fluorescent lights as it tumbled end over end across the polished surface. The metal hit the floor with a metallic ring that cut through every other sound in the terminal. It spun once, twice, 3 times before settling flat, the distinctive 5-point star with its pale blue ribbon spread around it like a pool of water. The effect was immediate and absolute. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. The ambient noise of the terminal seemed to drop away, leaving only the distant announcements of departing flights and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. People who had been walking past stopped in their tracks, their eyes fixed on the medal lying there on the floor. The Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. The light blue ribbon with 13 white stars. The bronze star with the word valor embossed across its center, suspended from the ribbon by an anchor. Even people who couldn't name it specifically recognized it, the way you recognize a flag or a national anthem, something embedded deep in cultural consciousness. "Oh my God," someone whispered from the crowd. "Is that?" Another voice began, trailing off into silence. The businessman stared at the medal, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and then slowly draining of all color. His mouth opened and closed without producing sound. The hand still gripping Renata's torn bag went slack, and the canvas fell to the floor. The woman with the phone had stopped recording, her arms slowly lowering as she stared at the medal with an expression that suggested her entire understanding of the situation had just inverted. Her lips moved silently, perhaps praying, perhaps just trying to process what she was seeing. Renata moved forward on her knees, her hand reaching for the metal with a tenderness that made several people in the crowd look away, suddenly aware they were witnessing something deeply personal. She picked it up carefully, her fingers trembling as they closed around the cool metal. For a moment, she just held it, her head bowed, her shoulders rising and falling with careful breaths. The older man who had spoken up earlier stood frozen, his weathered hand rising slowly to cover his mouth. His eyes had gone bright with moisture, and when he finally found his voice, it came out rough and thick. "Oh, son of a bitch," he breathed. "You're her." The security guard had gone pale, his hand falling away from his radio as if it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. His Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard, and he took an involuntary step backward. A man in his 50s wearing a faded Marine Corps t-shirt pushed through the crowd, his eyes locked on the metal in Renata's hand. He stopped a respectful distance away, his body coming to attention with the automatic precision of someone who had spent years responding to military bearing. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the terminal. "Forward Operating Base Cushman," he said. "September 16th. The Market Square ambush." Renata's head came up slowly, her eyes meeting his. She said nothing, but something passed between them, a recognition that went beyond words. The Marine's eyes glistened. "You pulled 6 soldiers out of that kill zone," he said, "under continuous fire. You took 3 rounds yourself and kept going back. They said you wouldn't stop until everyone was accounted for." The crowd had grown larger now, a full circle of people pressing in to see, to hear, to understand what was happening. Phones were still out, still recording, but the energy had completely shifted. This was no longer documentation of a confrontation. This was something else entirely. A younger woman in military uniform, army by the look of her insignia, had pushed to the front of the crowd. She stood at attention, her hand rising in a crisp salute that she held without wavering. Tears streamed openly down her face. Another person joined her, an older veteran in a Vietnam War cap. Then another, and another, service members and veterans appearing from the crowd like they had been waiting for a signal. They formed a rough line, all standing at attention, all saluting, all silent. Renata remained on her knees, the metal cradled in her hands, surrounded by her scattered belongings and the growing circle of people who suddenly understood exactly who she was and what she had done. She looked small in that moment, vulnerable, just a woman in worn clothes with tired eyes and a torn bag. But the metal in her hands told a different story. The silence in the terminal had become something physical, pressing down on everyone with the weight of collective realization. The businessman stood motionless, his face now completely drained of color, his earlier bravado evaporated like water on hot asphalt. His eyes were fixed on the metal in Renata's hands, and his expression had transformed into something resembling horror. The woman in the business suit had lowered her phone completely, both hands now pressed against her mouth as if trying to keep words from escaping. Her manicured nails looked absurdly trivial against the backdrop of what she was witnessing. Her eyes were wide, darting between Renata and the metal and the growing line of veterans standing at attention. Renata slowly rose to her feet, still holding the metal with both hands. She moved with careful deliberation, as if any sudden motion might shatter whatever strange spell had fallen over the terminal. The wooden case lay open on the floor beside her scattered belongings, its dark walnut interior lined with navy blue velvet that had faded slightly with time. The security guard found his voice first, though it came out strained and unfamiliar. "Ma'am, he started, then stopped, swallowing hard. "I apologize. I didn't know. I'm sorry." An older woman pushed through the crowd, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp and assessing. She wore a lanyard that identified her as a terminal manager, and she carried herself with the kind of authority that came from decades of handling difficult situations. She took in the scene with a single sweeping glance: the torn duffel bag, the scattered belongings, the metal, the line of saluting veterans, and the 2 passengers who had caused all of this. Her expression hardened as she turned to face the businessman, and his companion. "Would someone please explain to me what happened here?" she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Nobody spoke for a moment. The businessman's mouth worked soundlessly, searching for words that wouldn't come. The woman beside him had begun to cry, mascara tracking down her carefully made-up face in dark lines. "They assaulted her," the older man in the gray hair said, his voice rough with barely controlled anger. "They harassed her, they grabbed her, and he," pointing directly at the businessman, he ripped her bag open and kicked her metal across the floor like it was trash. The terminal manager's face went rigid. She turned to look at the businessman, and whatever she saw in his guilty expression confirmed everything she needed to know. She pulled out her radio with swift efficiency. "Security, I need a supervisor to gate 47 immediately. We have a situation that requires law enforcement involvement." The businessman finally found his voice, though it came out high and desperate. "I didn't know," he said, the words tumbling over each other. "How was I supposed to know? She looked like, she was sitting on the floor, and I just thought." "What did you think?" the terminal manager asked, her tone glacial. "That her appearance gave you the right to assault her? That the way she dressed meant she deserved to be treated like garbage?" The Marine who had recognized Renata stepped forward, his jaw set in hard lines. "That medal isn't given out for showing up," he said. "It's awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. There are only 73 living recipients. 73. Out of the entire United States military." A woman in the crowd gasped audibly. Someone else began clapping, slow and deliberate, and then others joined until the applause filled the terminal like rolling thunder. Renata stood in the center of it all, still holding her medal, looking smaller and more vulnerable than someone with her decorations should ever look. She raised one hand slightly, and the applause died away. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear. "It's okay," she said. "They didn't know." The terminal manager's expression suggested she disagreed strongly with that assessment. "It's not okay," she said firmly. "Ignorance is not an excuse for this kind of behavior." She turned to the security guard who had been too slow to intervene. "Get their identification information. I want a full incident report, and I want them banned from this airline." The businessman's eyes went wide with panic. "Banned? You can't. I'm a gold-level member. I've been flying with this airline for 15 years. And in those 15 years, you never learned basic human decency," the terminal manager said coldly. "Consider your membership terminated effective immediately." The woman was crying harder now, her expensive suit jacket shaking with her sobs. "I'm so sorry," she said, the words directed at Renata, but barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean, I would never have." Renata looked at her for a long moment, and something in her expression might have been pity. "I know," she said quietly. 2 airport police officers arrived, their uniforms crisp and their expressions serious. The terminal manager briefed them quickly, her words clipped and professional, while pointing at the businessman and woman. The officers listened, made notes, and then approached the 2 passengers who had started all of this. "Sir, ma'am, we're going to need you to come with us," one of the officers said. "We have some questions about the assault that occurred here." The businessman's face crumpled. "This is insane," he said, but his voice held no conviction. His shoulders sagged as the reality of consequences settled over him like a heavy coat. The woman said nothing, just continued to cry as the officers guided them away from the crowd. The terminal manager turned her attention to Renata, and her entire demeanor softened. "Ma'am, I cannot express how deeply sorry I am that this happened in our terminal. This kind of treatment is inexcusable, and I want to make it right." Renata shook her head slightly. "I just want to catch my flight," she said. The manager nodded, but her expression remained determined. "Let me arrange for you to wait in our premium lounge. Full amenities, completely complimentary. It's the least we can do." "That's not necessary," Renata began, but the manager held up a hand. "Please," she said, "allow us to show you the respect you should have received from the beginning." The line of veterans still stood at attention, their salutes unwavering. The young army soldier's arm had begun to tremble slightly from holding the position, but she didn't lower it. Others in the crowd had joined them now. Some military, some not, all showing whatever respect they knew how to offer. Renata carefully placed the medal back in its wooden case, her fingers lingering on the pale blue ribbon for just a moment before closing the lid with a soft click. She knelt again and began gathering her scattered belongings, and immediately half a dozen people moved forward to help. The Marine got there first, picking up her folded T-shirt with hands that treated it as carefully as he would handle a flag. Others collected her socks, her book, her toiletries, passing each item to her with a gentleness that suggested they understood these simple possessions belonged to someone extraordinary. A teenage girl, maybe 16, approached shyly with Renata's toothbrush in her outstretched hand. "Thank you for your service," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My dad's in Afghanistan right now. I hope people treat him better than they treated you today." Renata took the toothbrush and met the girl's eyes. "I hope so too," she said softly. "And I hope he comes home safe." The girl nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks, and then retreated back into the crowd. Within minutes, someone had produced a sturdy carry-on bag to replace Renata's torn duffel, passing it forward through the crowd like a relay baton. The Marine who had recognized her insisted on helping transfer her belongings, handling each item with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts. When everything was packed away, he zipped it closed and handed it to her with a slight bow of his head. The terminal manager gestured toward the far end of the concourse. "If you'll follow me, ma'am, I'll escort you to the lounge personally." Renata hesitated, glancing back at the concrete pillar where she had been sitting peacefully just 20 minutes earlier. The spot looked different now, marked by the incident in ways that had nothing to do with physical evidence. A moment ago, she had been invisible. Now she felt exposed, raw, like a wound that had been covered for too long suddenly laid bare. The older man with the gray hair stepped forward, and this time Renata noticed the small pin on his jacket collar. The combat infantryman badge. He was a veteran himself, probably Vietnam era based on his age. His eyes held the same haunted quality hers did, the look of someone who had seen things that changed them permanently. "Permission to speak freely, ma'am," he said, and despite the informal setting, his tone carried the weight of military protocol. Renata almost smiled. "Granted," she said quietly. "You handled that with more grace than most of us would have managed," he said. "I was 3 rows back watching the whole thing. Wanted to intervene sooner, but I'm old and slow and didn't trust my temper." He paused, his jaw working. "You show them what real discipline looks like, what real strength is." "I just wanted to wait for my flight," Renata said, and the exhaustion in her voice was suddenly palpable. "That's all I ever want, just to be left alone." The old veteran nodded slowly. "I know that feeling," he said. "The world doesn't make it easy for us, does it? Coming home is harder than being over there sometimes." A woman in her 30s approached, wearing yoga pants and a university sweatshirt, looking like a typical passenger except for the tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she said to Renata. "I was sitting right over there, and I watched it all happen, and I didn't say anything. I just sat there with my phone and my coffee, and I didn't say anything." Renata looked at her for a long moment. "You're saying something now," she said gently. The woman shook her head vehemently. "It's not enough. It's not nearly enough. You were being harassed and assaulted, and I just watched like it was entertainment. What does that make me?" "Human," Renata said simply. "It makes you human. We're all scared to get involved. We all tell ourselves it's not our business until suddenly it is." The terminal manager had been waiting patiently, but now she touched Renata's elbow with gentle insistence. "Ma'am, I really do need to get you somewhere more comfortable. The media has been notified about the incident, and I suspect they'll be arriving shortly. The lounge will give you privacy if you want it." Renata's expression tightened at the mention of media. That was the last thing she wanted. The attention, the questions, the inevitable request to recount the worst day of her life for the cameras. She had done enough interviews after receiving the medal, sat through enough ceremonies where people thanked her for her service while their eyes slid past her like she was a symbol rather than a person. The Marine seemed to sense her discomfort. We can form a perimeter if you need it, he offered. Get you to the lounge without the circus. That won't be necessary, Renata said, but she appreciated the offer. The fact that she had gone from being treated like trash to being offered protection by strangers in the span of 15 minutes felt surreal, like she had slipped into an alternate timeline. The crowd began to part as Renata followed the terminal manager toward the premium lounge. The line of veterans finally lowered their salutes, but they maintained their positions, creating a corridor of respect. As Renata passed each one, they nodded or murmured words of recognition. The young army soldier reached out tentatively, and when Renata took her hand, the soldier's composure finally broke. "You're why I enlisted," she said through tears. "I read about what you did. I wanted to be like you." Renata squeezed her hand gently. "Then be better than me," she said. "Come home whole. That's the real victory." They walked through the terminal, and Renata became aware of how many eyes were on her now. Not with the dismissive glances from before, but with something closer to awe. It was uncomfortable in a different way, being seen as something more than human rather than something less. She wasn't sure which was worse. A man in a pilot's uniform stood near the gate counter, and when he saw Renata approaching, he came to attention with the precision of someone who had military training before joining commercial aviation. He held his salute until she passed, his expression one of profound respect. The lounge doors were heavy glass, and when the terminal manager opened them, cool air and the scent of fresh coffee washed over them. The space was nearly empty, just a few business travelers scattered among the leather chairs and couches. They looked up as Renata entered, and she saw the moment when they recognized something was happening, their expressions shifting from curiosity to interest. "Please, make yourself comfortable anywhere you'd like," the terminal manager said. "Food and beverages are complimentary. If you need anything at all, just speak to any staff member." She hesitated, then added, "I've upgraded your seat to first class for your flight to Denver. It's already taken care of." Renata wanted to protest, to say that wasn't necessary, that she didn't need special treatment. But the manager's expression made it clear this wasn't about need. It was about the airline trying to make amends for a situation that never should have happened in the first place. "Thank you," Renata said quietly. The manager started to leave, then turned back. "What those people did to you today," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "it's not who we are. It's not who we want to be. I'm sorry they made you feel otherwise." After she left, Renata stood in the center of the lounge, holding her new bag, still feeling the weight of dozens of eyes that had watched her go from victim to hero in the span of minutes. She found a corner seat, away from the windows and the other passengers, and sank into it with a weariness that went bone deep. The wooden case with her medal was in the outside pocket of the new bag, easily accessible now instead of buried under clothes and toiletries. She could feel its presence like a physical weight, heavier than the actual medal and ribbon could account for. That medal represented the worst and best day of her life simultaneously. The day she had saved 6 lives and lost a part of herself that she would never get back. A server approached, young and professional, carrying a small tray. "Compliments of the lounge, ma'am," she said, setting down a glass of water and a warm towel. "Is there anything else I can get for you?" Renata shook her head. "This is perfect. Thank you." The server smiled and withdrew, and Renata was left alone with her thoughts and the quiet hum of the lounge around her. Through the glass walls, she could see the terminal continuing its normal rhythm. Passengers hurrying to gates, families reuniting, the constant flow of humanity moving through space. Out there, the businessman and woman were probably being questioned by airport police, their day ruined, their sense of superiority shattered by the revelation of who they had chosen to target. Renata picked up the warm towel and pressed it against her face, letting the heat soak into her skin. Her hands are shaking slightly, the adrenaline from the confrontation finally working its way out of her system. She had remained calm throughout the entire incident, had controlled her reactions and her responses the way her training demanded. But now, in the relative safety of a lounge, her body was reminding her that threat had been real, that the situation could have gone much worse. Renata had been sitting in the lounge for perhaps 20 minutes when a man in his late 50s approached her corner. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone who understood personal space and trauma, stopping a respectful distance away and waiting until she looked up before speaking. "Corporal Voss," he said, and the use of her rank made her stiffen slightly. "My name is Colonel Raymond Blackwell, retired. I was at the Pentagon when your citation came through. I wanted to meet you for 2 years now, though I never imagined it would be under these circumstances." Renata studied him, taking in the bearing that never quite left military officers even decades after retirement, the way he held himself with quiet authority. His eyes were kind but direct, the eyes of someone who had made difficult decisions and lived with their consequences. "Colonel," she said, nodding slightly but not standing. She was too tired to observe all the formalities, and something in his expression suggested he understood. "May I sit?" he asked, gesturing to the chair across from her. She nodded again, and he settled into the seat with a slight grunt that spoke of old injuries or simply old age. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Through the lounge windows, Renata could see a crowd still gathered near Gate 47, phones out, people talking in animated clusters. The incident had become a spectacle, and she hated that. "I saw what happened out there," Blackwell said finally. "Watched most of it on someone's live stream before I could get here for the other terminal." His jaw tightened. Those people had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw what they wanted to see, Renata said quietly. Someone who didn't fit their idea of who belongs in an airport. Someone easy to dismiss. Blackwell leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "I read your full after-action report," he said. "Not the sanitized version they released to the press. The real one. What you did that day, it wasn't just brave. It was calculated, brilliant tactical decision-making under the worst possible conditions." Renata's hands tightened on the arms of her chair. She didn't want to talk about this. Didn't want to relive the heat and the dust and the sound of small arms fire echoing off the market stalls. Didn't want to remember the weight of her squad leader's body as she dragged him behind cover, or the way Specialist Chun had looked at her with eyes that were already seeing something beyond this world. 6 extractions under sustained enemy fire, Blackwell continued, his voice gentle but insistent. 3 separate trips back into the kill zone. You took rounds to your vest, one through your shoulder, another through your leg. You kept fighting, kept pulling people out. When your rifle jammed, you picked up a fallen AK and kept providing suppressive fire while directing air support. The Taliban fighters thought they had trapped an entire squad. Instead, they ran into you. "Sir," Renata said, and her voice came out harder than she intended. "I appreciate the recognition, but I don't need a recap. I was there." Blackwell sat back, nodding slowly. "Of course you were. I apologize. Old habit, try to make sure people understand the significance of what they're witnessing. But you don't need me to tell you what you did. You need people to let you move on. That's all I've wanted for 2 years, Renata said. To just be a person again. Not a hero, not a symbol. Just someone who can sit in an airport without it becoming a production." A woman's voice came from behind them, sharp and professional. "Excuse me, Colonel Blackwell?" The terminal manager had returned, and she looked stressed. "We have a situation developing. Several news crews have arrived, and they're requesting interviews. Social media posts about the incident are going viral. We have over 50,000 views already, and climbing." Renata closed her eyes, feeling the weight of it settling over her like a familiar burden. This was how it always went. One moment of recognition, one incident captured on video, and suddenly she belonged to the public again. Her privacy, her desire for anonymity, none of that mattered when there was a story to tell. "I'm not doing interviews," Renata said flatly. The manager nodded quickly. "Of course, that's entirely your choice. But I wanted you to be aware that the footage is everywhere now. People are identifying you by name. Your service record is being shared. The airline's official statement will express our deepest apologies and support, but the media interest is likely to follow you even after you leave here." Renata felt something crack inside her chest, a hairline fracture in the wall she had built to keep herself together. She had worked so hard to fade into the background, to become unremarkable, to exist without drawing attention. And now, because two strangers had decided she didn't belong in their space, all of that was gone. Colonel Blackwell stood, moving to position himself between Renata and the manager. "Give us a moment, please," he said, and though his tone was polite, it carried enough authority that the manager nodded and retreated to a respectful distance. He turned back to Renata, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "You don't owe anyone anything," he said. "Not the media, not the public, not even the military. You've given enough. If you want to walk out of here and disappear, you have every right to do that." "I can't disappear now," Renata said bitterly. "My face is all over the internet. My name, my service record, probably my address by tomorrow. Some patriot with good intentions will post every detail of my life, thinking they're honoring me." Blackwell was quiet for a moment, considering. "Then let me make a suggestion," he said. "You don't have to give them what they want, but you could give them something. One statement, brief and on your terms, that satisfies the immediate curiosity. Control the narrative before the narrative controls you." Renata looked at him sharply. "I've played that game before, Colonel. I've sat for interviews and photo opportunities and ceremonies. It never satisfies them. They always want more." He held up his hands. "Fair point. Then here's my other offer. I have a car waiting outside. I can get you out of here through a service exit, away from the cameras. You catch your flight from a different terminal, and we create enough confusion that you have a head start before anyone figures out where you went." "Why would you do that?" Renata asked. "You don't know me." "Not really." Blackwell's expression softened. "Because I know what it's like to want to be invisible after serving," he said. "Because I watched my daughter struggle with PTSD for 3 years after her deployment, and I saw how the attention made it worse. Because you deserve the choice to be private, if that's what you need." Renata studied his face, looking for the angle, the hidden agenda. In her experience, people always wanted something. Recognition, reflected glory, a chance to be part of a story they could tell at dinner parties. But Blackwell's eyes held only honest concern, the kind that came from understanding rather than exploitation. A commotion at the lounge entrance made them both turn. 2 men in suits had arrived, and they carried themselves with the particular confidence of federal agents or military intelligence. The terminal manager was trying to intercept them, but they showed her identification that made her step aside immediately. "Corporal Voss," one of them called across the lounge. "We need to speak with you about the incident. There are some security concerns that need to be addressed." Blackwell muttered something under his breath that might have been a curse. "So much for a quiet exit," he said. Renata stood, her exhaustion temporarily pushed aside by wariness. "Security concerns," she repeated. "About what?" "A torn bag and a medal?" The agents approached, and the one who had spoken pulled out a badge that identified him as Department of Defense Security. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe that the individuals who assaulted you may have had prior knowledge of your identity and your Medal of Honor. We need to determine whether this was a random confrontation or something more targeted." Renata felt her entire body go still, the way it did when a situation shifted from uncomfortable to potentially dangerous. "Targeted," she repeated, her voice carefully neutral. "What makes you think this was anything other than 2 entitled passengers having a bad day?" The second agent, a woman with short dark hair and sharp eyes, pulled out a tablet and turned it toward Renata. "We've been monitoring online chatter for the past hour," she said. "Multiple social media accounts began posting about your presence in this terminal approximately 45 minutes before the incident occurred. Some of those accounts have connections to extremist groups that have expressed hostility toward military personnel." Renata took the tablet, scrolling through screenshots of posts. There she was in several photos, sitting against the pillar, clearly identifiable despite her attempt to remain inconspicuous. The timestamps showed they had been posted well before the businessman and woman had confronted her. The comments beneath ranged from respectful recognition to something much darker. Messages suggesting that military members like her were part of a corrupt system, that her medal was propaganda, that she deserved to be taken down. Colonel Blackwell had moved closer, reading over Renata's shoulder. His expression had gone cold and professional. "Are you saying someone orchestrated that confrontation?" That those two passengers were working with these groups? The male agent shook his head. We don't believe the passengers themselves were involved in any conspiracy. Their background checks show them to be exactly what they appeared: wealthy, entitled civilians with no connection to extremist organizations. But someone may have identified Corporal Voss's location and deliberately agitated the situation, possibly hoping for exactly the kind of viral incident that occurred. Renata handed back the tablet, her mind racing through implications. So I was doxxed before I was even confronted, she said. Someone wanted this to happen. Wanted me identified. Wanted me humiliated. The question is why? The female agent's expression was grim. You're one of the most visible Medal of Honor recipients from recent conflicts, Corporal. Your story has been used extensively in recruitment materials and media coverage. That makes you a target for certain groups who oppose military intervention or who have broader anti-government ideologies. This isn't the first time, is it? Colonel Blackwell said quietly, looking at Renata. You've dealt with this kind of attention before. Renata's jaw tightened. There had been incidents. Letters sent to her apartment, some supportive, some threatening. Online harassment that came in waves whenever her story resurfaced in the news cycle. A man who had shown up at a speaking event with a knife, claiming that heroes like her were really killers hiding behind medals. She had learned to be careful, to vary her routines, to keep her presence online minimal. But she couldn't be invisible forever, and clearly someone had been watching closely enough to track her movements. What do you need from me? Renata asked the agents. Right now, just your statement about what happened, the male agent said. We need to establish a timeline and determine if there were any other individuals who seemed to be observing or influencing the situation. After that, we'll need to have a conversation about your security protocols going forward. A laugh escaped Renata before she could stop it, harsh and bitter. Security protocols. I just want to visit my sister in Denver. I want to have a normal life. I don't want to live like I'm still deployed, constantly checking sight lines and threat assessment. The female agent's expression softened slightly. I understand, Corporal, but the reality is that your visibility makes you vulnerable. We can provide resources, training, even protection details if necessary. I don't want protection details, Renata said sharply. I don't want to be surrounded by armed guards everywhere I go. That's not living, that's just existing in a different kind of prison. Colonel Blackwell placed a hand on her shoulder, gentle but grounding. Take a breath, he said quietly. They're trying to help, even if it doesn't feel that way right now. Renata forced herself to inhale slowly, to release the tension building in her chest. The lounge suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in despite the open layout and high ceilings. She could see other passengers pretending not to watch while stealing glances at the conversation happening in the corner. More witnesses, more documentation of a life she couldn't seem to keep private. Walk me through what happened, the male agent said, pulling out a notebook. Start from when you first arrived at gate 47. Renata recounted the story mechanically, keeping her voice steady and professional. She described sitting against the pillar, the woman's initial demand that she move, the businessman's escalation, the crowd's reaction. She mentioned the older veteran who had spoken up, the flight attendant named Diane, the security guard's delayed response. When she got to the part where the businessman had grabbed her bag and torn it open, her voice faltered for just a moment before she pushed through. The agents took notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Were there any individuals who seemed to be filming before the confrontation became physical? Did anyone attempt to intervene earlier and get prevented by the crowd? Did she notice anyone who appeared to be coordinating or communicating with others? Renata answered what she could, but her attention had started fracturing. She was back in the desert market, the smell of spices and exhaust and fear. The sound of the first shots cracking through the morning air. The way her squad leader had looked at her when he realized they were pinned down, that look that said make the call, make it now, make it count. She had been 23 years old and suddenly responsible for whether 6 people lived or died. Corporal, the female agent said, her voice cutting through the memory. Are you all right? Do you need a moment? Renata blinked, forcing herself back to the present. I'm fine, she said automatically, the the response so ingrained it came without thought. Colonel Blackwell's hand was still on her shoulder, and she felt him squeeze gently. "You don't have to be fine," he said quietly. "Not with us." The male agent closed his notebook. "We have enough for now," he said. "We'll be in touch within 24 hours with a full threat assessment and recommendations. In the meantime, I strongly suggest you accept the airline's offer to board early and use a private boarding process. The fewer people who can track your movements today, the better." Through the lounge windows, Renata could see that the crowd at Gate 47 had grown even larger. News cameras had arrived, their lights bright, even in the well-lit terminal. Reporters stood with microphones, interviewing passengers who had witnessed the incident. The businessman and woman were nowhere to be seen, probably still being questioned by airport police or already banned from the premises. A young Marine approached the group hesitantly, his dress blues immaculate, his cover tucked under his arm. "Ma'am," he said to Renata, "I don't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to say thank you. My unit deployed to the same region where you served. The tactics you developed, the lessons learned from your action, they saved lives in my platoon. You saved lives you'll never meet, in fights you'll never know about." Renata looked at him, at his young face and earnest eyes, and felt something shift in her chest. This was why the attention mattered, even when she hated it. Because her story wasn't just about her anymore. It belonged to everyone who had come after, everyone who had learned from what she had done, everyone who had made it home because of lessons written in blood. "What's your name, Marine?" she asked. "Lance Corporal de Von Hayes, Mom. 2nd Battalion, 7th Marines." "Where are you headed, Devon?" "Home, ma'am. 2 weeks leave before we redeploy." Renata stood and extended her hand. "Go home safe," she said. "Come back whole. That's an order." He took her hand, his grip firm and respectful. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and then he snapped to attention and saluted with parade ground precision before turning and walking away. The departure board announced that Renata's flight would begin boarding in 15 minutes. The terminal manager returned with a subtle nod toward Colonel Blackwell, indicating that arrangements had been made for a private boarding process. But before Renata could gather her belongings, a commotion at the lounge entrance drew everyone's attention. An older woman pushed past the front desk attendant, moving with the determined urgency of someone who wouldn't be denied. She was perhaps 70, with white hair pulled into a loose bun and weathered hands that gripped a worn leather portfolio. Her eyes scanned the lounge until they landed on Renata, and something in her expression made Renata's breath catch. "Please," the woman said, her voice carrying across the space. "I need to speak with Corporal Voss. Just for a moment. Please." The security agents moved to intercept her, but Colonel Blackwell held up a hand. "Let her approach," he said quietly, something in his tone suggesting he recognized the look on the woman's face, the desperate need that transcended protocol. The woman stopped a few feet from Renata, and up close, her eyes were red-rimmed from crying. Her hands trembled as she clutched the portfolio against her chest. "My name is Margaret Chun," she said. "My son was Specialist Thomas Chun. He was in your squad." Renata felt the floor drop out from under her. Chun, Tommy Chun, who had been 20 years old and obsessed with comic books, who had carried photos of his girlfriend and talked about proposing when he got home. Tommy Chun, who had taken 2 rounds to the chest in the first volley of fire and had bled out before the medevac could arrive, despite everything Renata had done to save him. "Ma'am," Renata managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret Chin's face crumpled. "I saw the video," she said. "I saw what those people did to you, how they treated you. And I just couldn't let you leave without telling you. Without you knowing." "Knowing what?" Renata asked, though part of her didn't want to hear the answer, didn't want to face the mother of a man she had failed to bring home alive. "That you gave him 6 more minutes," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "The medical report said he was struck at approximately on in 4 to 3. You reach him at on in a 45, pulled him to cover, applied pressure to his wounds. You stayed with him even while directing the others, even while under fire. He died at on in a 14, and according to the combat medic's report, you were holding his hand." Renata's vision blurred. She remembered those 6 minutes like they were carved into her bones. The weight of Chin's body as she dragged him behind the concrete barrier. The way his blood had soaked through her gloves, warm and slick. The sound of his breathing, rapid and shallow, fighting for every breath. She had known he was dying, had known the wounds were too severe, but she had stayed anyway because no one should die alone, especially not a 20-year-old kid who just wanted to go home and propose to his girlfriend. I couldn't save him, Renata said, the words breaking apart. I tried, but I couldn't. Margaret reached out and took Renata's hands in hers, and her grip was stronger than it looked. You gave him peace, she said firmly. The medic told me Tommy's last words were, "Tell my mom I wasn't scared." He could only say that because you were there, because you made him feel safe even at the end. The lounge had gone completely silent. Even the agents had stepped back, recognizing that this moment transcended security concerns and threat assessments. Colonel Blackwell had turned away slightly, his jaw working as he struggled with his own emotions. Margaret opened the portfolio with shaking hands and pulled out a folded flag, the kind presented to families at military funerals. Beneath, it was a photograph of a young man in uniform, his smile bright and untroubled, frozen in a moment before war had touched him. Next to that was a letter, the paper worn from being read countless times. He wrote this 3 days before he died, Margaret said. He wrote about you, about how you ran extra drills to keep them sharp, how you checked on everyone's mental health, how you told stupid jokes to keep morale up. He said you were the kind of leader who made him believe he'd make it home. Renata took the letter with trembling hands. The handwriting was messy, enthusiastic, full of the energy that Tommy had carried with him everywhere. She read through tears about how Corporal Voss was tough but fair, how she had his back, and he had hers, how she made the squad feel like family instead of just a military unit. Near the end, Tommy had written, "If anything happens to me, I hope she knows she did everything right. I hope she doesn't blame herself. Tell her I said that." "I blame myself every day," Renata said, her voice breaking completely. "Every single day for 2 years. I should have moved faster, should have seen the ambush coming, should have positioned us better." Margaret pulled Renata into a hug, and Renata collapsed into it, her carefully maintained composure finally shattering. The older woman held her while she sobbed, one hand stroking her hair the way a mother comforts a child. Around them, people in the lounge were crying too, witnessing something raw and sacred that transcended the usual boundaries of public space. "He chose to serve," Margaret whispered. "He chose to go. What happened wasn't your fault. The enemy pulled those triggers, not you. You gave 6 soldiers a chance to go home to their families. You gave my son dignity in his final moments. That's not failure. That's grace under the worst circumstances imaginable." "The other 5, Renata said through her tears. "Did they make it?" Margaret nodded against her shoulder. "All 5 came home alive because of you. I met their families. We stay in touch. They all wanted to be here, but I'm the only one who lives close enough to get to the airport in time." She pulled back slightly, still holding Renata's shoulders. "They asked me to tell you something if I found you. They said to tell you that they're living full lives, getting married, having children, pursuing careers, making the most of every day. They said to tell you that you didn't just save their lives that day. You gave them futures." Renata couldn't speak, could only nod as tears continued to stream down her face. For 2 years, she had carried the weight of Tommy Chin's death like a stone around her neck. She had replayed those minutes endlessly, searching for the moment where she could have done something different, something better, something that would have brought all 6 home alive. The metal around her neck had felt like a lie, recognition for an action that had cost a young man his future. But Margaret Chin was here, telling her that those 6 minutes had mattered, that staying with Tommy while he died hadn't been a failure, but a gift, that the other 5 soldiers were living lives that wouldn't have existed without her actions. Colonel Blackwell approached quietly, his own eyes wet. "Ma'am," he said to Margaret, "I think I speak for everyone here when I say thank you. Thank you for coming, for sharing this, for giving Corporal Voss what she needed to hear." Margaret nodded. then turned back to Renata. I saw those people treat you like you were nothing today, she said. I saw them dump your belongings on the floor like trash. And I thought about how my son would have reacted to that, how angry he would have been. She smiled through her tears. He always said you deserved more respect than the entire chain of command combined. The boarding announcement came over the intercom, calling for passengers with special needs and first-class seating. The terminal manager appeared at Renata's elbow with gentle insistence. Ma'am, we need to get you to the gate. Renata looked at Margaret Shun, this woman who had lost her son and somehow found the strength to thank the person who had held his hand as he died. Can I keep this? She asked, holding up the letter. It's yours, Margaret said. I made copies, but I wanted you to have the original. I wanted you to carry his words with you. Renata carefully folded Tommy Chen's letter and placed it in the wooden case alongside her medal. The two pieces of metal and paper now forever linked in her mind. Margaret watched with a sad smile, then reached into her portfolio one more time and pulled out a small pin, the kind family members wore to honor their fallen soldiers. It bore Tommy's name, rank, and the dates of his birth and death. For you, Margaret said, pressing it into Renata's palm. So you remember that you gave him peace. That matters more than you know. Renata closed her fingers around the pin, feeling its edges press into her skin. Thank you, she managed, for finding me, for telling me, for not hating me. Margaret's expression turned fierce. Hate you? Child, I could never hate you. You're the reason my son didn't die alone and terrified. You're the reason I know his last moments were spent with someone who cared about him. That's a gift I can never repay. They embraced once more, and then Margaret stepped back, nodding to Colonel Blackwell and the security agents. Take care of her, she said. She's more fragile than she looks, and she's earned the right to be. Colonel Blackwell gave a slight bow. You have my word, ma'am. The terminal manager gestured toward a service corridor that would bypass the crowds and media. If you're ready, Corporal Voss, we can get you to your gate now. The captain has been informed of the situation and has agreed to hold the aircraft for a few additional minutes, if necessary. Renata picked up her new bag, the wooden case secure in the outer pocket, Tommy's pin still clutched in her other hand. She took one last look at the lounge, at the faces of strangers who had witnessed her breakdown and breakdown rebuilt, and then she followed the manager into the corridor. The hallway was utilitarian, marked with staff-only signs, and lined with equipment carts and cleaning supplies. Their footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, a stark contrast to the carpeted elegance of the premium lounge. Colonel Blackwell walked beside her, maintaining a respectful silence, while the two security agents followed at a discreet distance. They emerged onto the jetway through a door marked for crew access only. The gate area beyond was still crowded with passengers waiting to board, but Renata was shielded from view by the jetway walls. A flight attendant waited at the aircraft door, her expression professional but warm. Welcome aboard, Corporal Voss, she said quietly. Your seat is ready, and we've asked the other first-class passengers to respect your privacy during the flight. Renata nodded her thanks and stepped into the aircraft. The first-class cabin was spacious and quiet, with only a handful of other passengers already seated. They glanced up as she entered, and she saw the moment of recognition flash across several faces. But true to the flight attendant's word, they simply nodded respectfully and returned to their phones and magazines, granting her the anonymity she craved. Her seat was a window position in the second row, the leather soft and the legroom generous compared to the cramped coach seats she usually occupied. She stowed her bag in the overhead compartment, but kept the wooden case with her, placing it on the seat beside her like a passenger of its own. Colonel Blackwell appeared at her row, having followed her onto the aircraft. I'm in coach, he said, but I wanted to make sure you were settled before I took my seat. He handed her a business card with his personal contact information. If you need anything, and I mean anything, you call that number. Day or night. I mean it. Renata took the card, studying the embossed text. Why are you doing this? She asked. You don't owe me anything. His expression softened. Because someone did the same for me 30 years ago when I came back from Desert Storm with more demons than I knew how to fight. because paying it forward is the only way any of us survive this. He paused, then added, and because you remind me of my daughter. She has your same stubborn insistence on carrying everything alone. Tell her it doesn't work, Renata said quietly. Tell her the weight doesn't get lighter. You just get stronger at pretending it isn't there. Blackwell smiled sadly. I'll tell her you said that. She might actually listen to you. He stepped back into the aisle. Safe travels, Corporal. And remember, being strong enough to accept help isn't weakness. It's wisdom. He disappeared toward the back of the aircraft, and Renata was left alone with her thoughts and the wooden case beside her. Through the window, she could see the airport terminal, the crowds still visible in the distance, the news vans with their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Somewhere out there, the businessman and woman who had started this cascade of events were dealing with consequences. Somewhere else, Margaret Shun was driving home, carrying the weight of her son's memory with the grace of someone who had learned to live with loss. The other first-class passengers began boarding, moving past her row with polite nods and carefully averted eyes. An elderly man in a veteran's cap paused at her row, touching his cap in a silent salute before moving on. A young woman with kind eyes simply mouthed "thank you" as she passed. A businessman in an expensive suit stopped and said quietly, "My brother served with the 101st in Afghanistan. He didn't make a home. Thank you for bringing others home." Renata acknowledged each gesture with a nod, feeling the weight of their recognition settle over her like a cloak. It was still uncomfortable, still not what she would have chosen, but Margaret Chin's words had shifted something fundamental in her understanding. These people weren't seeing her as a spectacle or a symbol. They were seeing her as someone who had done something difficult and necessary, someone who had paid a price for it, someone who deserved respect, not because she was perfect, but because she had tried. The general boarding began, and coach passengers filed past, most too focused on finding their seats and stowing luggage to pay attention to who occupied first class. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, broke free from her mother's hand and ran up to Renata's row, her face bright with innocent curiosity. "Are you a soldier?" the girl asked, pointing at Tommy Chin's pin that Renata had clipped to her jacket. Her mother hurried up, apologizing profusely. "Emma, don't bother the nice lady. Come back to our seats." "She's not bothering me," Renata said, surprising herself. She looked at the little girl, seeing the same wide-eyed wonder that Tommy Chin's girlfriend must have seen when he told her about joining the army. "I was a soldier, yes." "Did you fight bad guys?" Emma asked. Renata considered the question, thinking about how to answer honestly without burdening a child with the truth of what war really meant. "I protected people," she said finally. "That was my job, making sure good people could go home to their families." Emma's mother had tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she said quietly. "My husband is deployed right now. Marines in Okinawa. Every day, I pray someone like you is looking out for him. I hope he comes home safe," Renata said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Emma suddenly threw her arms around Renata's neck in an impulsive hug, the kind only children give, completely unself-conscious and pure. "You're a hero," she whispered into Renata's ear, then pulled back and ran to her mother, who guided her toward their seats in coach with apologetic backward glances. The flight attendant began the safety demonstration, and Renata went through the familiar motions of buckling her seatbelt and locating the emergency exits. The aircraft engines powered up, their deep rumble vibrating through the cabin. Outside the window, the ground crew was removing the chocks and preparing to push back from a gate. Renata placed her hand on the wooden case beside her, feeling the smooth walnut under her palm. Inside was a medal that represented the worst and best moments of her life. Inside was a letter from a young man who had forgiven her for being unable to save him. Together, they represented a truth she was only beginning to understand, that heroism wasn't about being perfect or invincible. It was about showing up when it mattered, doing your best under impossible circumstances, and living with the results even when they broke your heart. The aircraft lifted off smoothly, banking over the city as it climbed toward cruising altitude. Renata watched through the window as the airport grew smaller below, the terminal where her life had been exposed and examined and somehow transformed into something new. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the landscape, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Once they reached altitude and the seatbelt sign chimed off, the flight attendant approached with a small tray. "Compliments of the captain," she said quietly, setting down a glass of wine and a handwritten note on airline stationery. Renata unfolded the note. It read, "Corporal Voss, it is an honor to have you aboard. Thank you for your service and sacrifice. If there is anything my crew or I can do to make your flight more comfortable, please don't hesitate to ask. Captain Sarah Reeves, USAF Reserve, retired." Another veteran, Renata thought, feeling a connection across the aircraft to the woman flying them toward Denver. The military community was like that, a network of shared experience that transcended rank and branch and time. Captain Reeves understood what it meant to serve, what it cost, and what came after. That understanding required no explanation, no performance, just quiet recognition between people who had been changed by the same forces. Renata sipped the wine slowly, letting the warmth spread through her chest. Through the cabin, she could hear the normal sounds of flight. Conversations in low voices, the rustle of magazines, a baby fussing briefly before being soothed. It was ordinary and peaceful, exactly what she had wanted when she sat down against that pillar hours ago. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she pulled it out to find dozens of messages and notifications. Her sister had texted multiple times, having seen the viral videos and panicking about whether Renata was okay. Friends from her unit had reached out, offering support and colorful threats against anyone who disrespected her. Even her old squad leader, recovered from his wounds and now teaching at a military academy, had sent a message, "Saw what happened. Those people have no idea who they mess with. Call me when you land." But one message stood out from a number she didn't recognize. It was from the young Army soldier who had saluted her in the terminal. "Ma'am, I know this is forward, but I wanted to thank you again. I ship out in 3 weeks, and I was terrified. Seeing you today, seeing how you handled everything with such grace and strength, it reminded me why I enlisted. You showed me what real courage looks like, not just in combat, but in everyday life. Thank you for that gift." Renata read the message 3 times, feeling something shift in her chest. For 2 years, she had avoided her own story, had tried to distance herself from the recognition and attention. She had seen her Medal of Honor as a weight rather than a testament, a reminder of failure rather than success. But Margaret Chun had given her a new lens to see through, and this young soldier had reinforced it. Her story mattered not because it was perfect, but because it was real, because it showed that heroes weren't invincible warriors without fear or doubt. They were regular people who showed up when it mattered, who did their best under terrible circumstances, who carried the cost of their choices and kept moving forward. If her story could help someone else find courage, could help them believe they were capable of doing hard things, then maybe the exposure and attention had purpose after all. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, and the cabin lights dimmed as passengers settled in for the flight. Renata opened the wooden case and looked at her medal in the fading light. The bronze star caught the last rays of sunlight, and for the first time in 2 years, she didn't feel the crushing weight of inadequacy when she looked at it. She felt something closer to acceptance. She unfolded Tommy Chen's letter and read it again, his enthusiastic word a reminder that she had done more than just survive that day in a market square. She had given 6 soldiers a chance, and 5 of them had taken it all the way home. The 6th had died knowing he wasn't alone, that someone cared enough to stay with him until the end. In a world of war and chaos and senseless violence, that mattered. It might not be enough to erase the nightmares or silence the what-ifs, but it was something real and true and worth honoring. A flight attendant passing through the cabin paused at her row. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" she asked quietly. Renata looked up, and maybe it was the wine or the altitude or the emotional exhaustion of the day, but she smiled. A real smile, not the tight professional mask she usually wore. "Yes," she said. "I think it actually is." The hours passed in comfortable silence. Renata dozed intermittently, her sleep lighter than she would have liked, but undisturbed by the usual nightmares. When she woke, she watched the landscape slide past below, the patchwork of fields and towns connected by ribbons of highway, all those lives happening simultaneously beneath her, each one carrying its own weight and joy and struggle. As they began their descent into Denver, the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. I want to take a moment to acknowledge a very special passenger we have aboard today. Corporal Renata Voss, Medal of Honor recipient, is traveling with us. Corporal Voss exemplifies the very best of military service and personal courage. On behalf of the crew and all your fellow passengers, thank you for your service and sacrifice." The cabin erupted in applause, sustained and genuine. Renata felt her face flush, uncomfortable with the attention, but also somehow moved by it. She nodded acknowledgement to the passengers who turned to look at her, seeing respect and gratitude in their faces rather than the dismissive contempt that had met her at the beginning of this journey. The wheels touched down smoothly, and the aircraft taxied toward the gate. As they pulled up to the jetway, the captain's voice returned. "Corporal Voss, if you could remain seated for just a moment after we reach the gate, we have a small surprise for you." Renata's stomach tightened with anxiety, but she stayed in her seat as the other passengers began gathering their belongings. They filed past her row, and many paused to shake her hand, to thank her, to share brief stories about family members who served. Emma, the little girl from earlier, waved enthusiastically as her mother guided her off the aircraft. When the cabin had emptied, Captain Reeves emerged from the cockpit. She was in her 50s, with short silver hair and the bearing of someone who had commanded respect in multiple arenas. She approached Renata's row and extended her hand. "Corporal," she said as they shook, "I flew transport missions in Iraq. I carried soldiers like you to forward operating bases and brought the wounded home. It's an honor to have you aboard." "The honor is mine," Captain Renata said. Reeves smiled. "I wanted to tell you something. I saw the videos from the terminal. I saw how those people treated you, and I saw how you responded. With dignity and restraint and grace. That's just as much heroism as what you did in that market square, maybe more so. Anyone can fight when they have a weapon and authority. It takes real strength to maintain your humanity when people try to strip it from you." "Thank you," Renata said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." "One more thing," Reeves said. "Your sister is waiting at the gate. We gave her a heads up that you were coming." She gestured toward the jetway. "Go see your family. Corporal, you've earned it." Renata gathered her belongings, the wooden case secure in her hand, Tommy's pin still affixed to her jacket. She walked up the jetway, each step carrying her further from the chaos of the day and closer to something that felt like home. Her sister was waiting just beyond the gate, tears already streaming down her face. They collided in an embrace that lasted long enough for other passengers to flow around them like water around stones. When they finally pulled apart, her sister held her at arm's length, examining her face. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I saw everything. I was so scared for you." "I'm okay," Renata said, and for the first time in a very long time, she believed it. "I'm actually okay." If this story moved you, drop a comment about what resonated most with you. Share your favorite moment, or tell us about someone you know who showed quiet strength in the face of injustice. Maybe you've witnessed similar courage in your own life, or maybe you've been that person standing up when it mattered. Your stories matter, and we'd love to hear them. They walked together toward baggage claim, two sisters reunited after too long apart, and Renata felt the weight she had carried for 2 years begin to ease just slightly. It would never disappear completely. She knew that now. The memories and the guilt and the nightmares would always be part of her story. But so would this day, this moment when strangers had seen her at her most vulnerable and chosen to lift her up instead of tearing her down. She thought about the businessman and woman who had started this cascade of events, and she found she didn't hate them. They were products of a society that taught people to judge worth by appearance, to value comfort over compassion. Maybe their humiliation today would teach them something. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, it was no longer her burden to carry. What she would carry instead was Margaret Chen's gift, the knowledge that she had given a dying soldier peace in his final moments, that she had brought 5 others home to build futures they wouldn't have had otherwise, that her actions had rippled outward in ways she would never fully comprehend, touching lives and changing outcomes in a web of causality too complex to trace. As they stepped out into the Denver evening, the mountain air crisp and clean, Renata took a deep breath and let it out slowly. Somewhere above them, another aircraft was taking off, carrying other passengers toward their own destinations and destinies. Somewhere in the distance, families were gathering for dinner. Children were doing homework. Ordinary life was unfolding in countless beautiful and mundane ways. And for the first time since taking off her uniform 2 years ago, Renata felt like she might actually be part of that world again.